All right, what's going on, everyone? So we got another pretty interesting breakdown as to what's going on in the war in Ukraine, what's going on specifically around the counteroffensive in the south. This was a special report put out pretty recently by RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute, titled Stormbreak, Fighting Through Russian Defenses in Ukraine's 2023 Offensive. It's by Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds. I've cited both those guys before in the past. They've put a lot of really, really good work into understanding a lot of the dynamics around the war in Ukraine. And as always, we'll link the full report in the description below. It's about 28 pages, which all things considered isn't that long for something this complex. The reason they were able, more digestible though, right? Easier to get through. The reason they were able to kind of consolidate it down to 28 pages is the way they broke this report out is the first portion that we're going to go through here. There's really four portions. The first two are diving into tactical level situations and kind of how those played out, specifically around an area called Novodarivka and then Rivnopil. They then further go into kind of Ukrainian and Russian lessons learned and how those are playing out in the battlefield, kind of adaptations, not just at the tactical level, but above. So starting out, they say that the Ukrainian offensive began in late May with a period of protracted preparatory artillery fires, so really an uptick in long-range fires. They say usually Ukrainian howitzers would have to displace 2 to 15 minutes from opening fire, depending on their distance from different threat systems. Counter-battery threat, right? As soon as you fire, the enemy knows where you are, they're going to engage you. That's how it's been throughout the entire war. This time, they say, however, it was clear that Ukrainian intelligence had accurately marked down Russian firing positions, and with the greater range afforded by 155mm guns, the Ukrainian gunners quickly caused Russian artillery to be pulled back. Now, the range of a 155mm gun isn't going to be drastically different than 152. You're kind of, splitting hairs at that point. But that would mean some of the shorter range weapon systems, the 122mm howitzers, some of the self-propelled systems might have been what Russia had a little closer to the front, providing that more direct fire support or direct support in terms of artillery. And if that's the case, Ukraine dialed those in, had an understanding of where the systems were before they opened fire, and then, at least right out the gate, were not as exposed to the counter-battery fire as they had been in the past. They continued, there was a sense of elation among the crews and the infantry watching the fire. For months, each gun was strictly limited in the number of rounds available. Ukraine had been trying to conserve its ammunition to stockpile for the offensive. Now there was freedom to fire, and when calls for resupply were made, additional rounds were promptly delivered. The argument about Ukrainian ammunition supply, especially artillery ammunition supply, has been a hot topic, a very important topic. There's been a lot of very notable, I would say, trustworthy analysts who have said this offensive, counteroffensive, offensive, whatever you want to call it, in the South would not be possible without without having a significant stockpile of artillery ammunition. It is that dependent on fire. So not crazy that for the period of time leading up to this, there was a reduction in how many rounds would be used for various targets. They add that reconnaissance by day would locate Russian positions, which would be attacked at night using converted agricultural UAVs dropping RPGs. It's not something I've heard a lot about, agricultural UAVs. But anyways, continuing on with this, they say if Russian electronic warfare was active, the UAVs could not get in and usually were not committed. If there was a relaxation in electronic protection, the effects could be dramatic. This is something they get into later in the article. The Russian electronic warfare capabilities right now, as it seems, is it's either on or it's off. If it's on, it's very hard to get anything up in the air over some of the Russian positions, the area that's covered. And when it's off, then it's free reign. So it does seem like there's the ability of the Ukrainian forces to monitor that. And for whatever reason, when it turns off, they take advantage. In this specific case, they say 5 UAVs, each carrying 4 RPGs, were dispatched, destroying or seriously damaging 7 of a grouping of tanks, although all of the UAVs were lost in the process. Look, that's pretty significant for a group of UAVs to destroy or damage 7 tanks in one run. I mean, I don't think anybody at this point is confused about how effective and influential drones have been on the battlefield, but right there, right? They're not even actively in the fight. They're set back in the front and tanks are being knocked out left and right, 7 at a time. That's significant. Moving into these offensive actions, this was really right at the beginning of what, big picture is looking like. The big picture we're calling the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the South. They say the decision to attempt a breach of the initial Russian fighting positions was taken on the evening of June 3rd. The initial attack, they say, was to aim to breach an area where the minefields were less dense because of the short distance between the lines and to break into the village of Novodarivka. I thought that was interesting there, talking about an area where the minefields were less dense. There's not a great way to determine that. There's some aerial observation platforms that can kind of start to get into that, but they went with a simple answer of if there's less area between our lines and the Russian positions, and they've got some maps showing that I'll pull up here as well, there's just going to be less mines that you have to deal with, right? But if you're from the Russian perspective, the shortest path between the two positions was probably also where they were somewhat expecting an assault. The article continues. After identifying the points for the breach, the offensive started early in the morning of June 4th. Two UR-77 Meteorite charges, which are, it's kind of like the Soviet version, Russian version of the Miklik mine-clearing line charges, same idea, were fired across the narrowest part of the minefield, blowing 2 6-meter wide channels from the tree line to the north edge of Novodarivka. Under covering fire from artillery, the first column advanced along the eastern breach. The column was led by a pair of tanks, followed by Max Pro MRAPs carrying the infantry. Unfortunately, the MRAPs struggled in the boggy ground, especially in the wake of the tanks. Several of the MRAPs bogged in while the cleared lane was insufficiently wide for other vehicles to pass. It was at this point, with the column fully committed to the breach, that a pair of Russian tanks unmasked and began to engage the column. So when you think about minefields, and this is the point they're going to hit on a couple times in this article, it's not just the risk of the vehicles driving over the mines as they move forward. So now you have to clear a lane, but as soon as that lane is cleared, you can't really deviate from that path, or the point of clearing that lane was it's null and void, right? So it canalizes movement of an offensive operation of this sort. So we're going to see in another operation, or I think it's another part of this operation here in a little bit, when the vehicles, rather than sitting ducks, the first vehicle's knocked out, all of a sudden you've essentially just created one narrow road that you can move through. For the tanks in this case, just the 2 tanks, they're able to take pretty clean and easy shots against these stuck Ukrainian vehicles that had nowhere to go. And the Ukrainian vehicles got to choose. Do we sit here and hope we don't get hit by the tanks? Or do we try to maneuver around and risk running into the hundreds or thousands of mines in the area? They say the Ukrainian tanks fired back at a range of around 800 meters. Nevertheless, the vehicles in the column were knocked out in succession. Infantry disembarking either turned back or pressed forward along the cleared lane, trying to find shelter. Now, what they get into here in a bit is as some of those infantrymen moved forward, it's not clear how many, what percentage pushed into the town versus those that moved back and maybe try to tie in with other forces. But they're going to talk about the infantry in the town and how that affected the fight going forward. They say the commitment of the 2nd Company to the Western Breach was necessitated both by the requirement to make progress against the objective and to reinforce the troops in Novodarivka. So again, that handful that moved forward was not enough to take the town by itself. And again, they didn't really have the armored vehicle support because a lot of those were knocked out by those 2 Russian tanks. So they had to get more troops into this village to continue the fight. They say, however, when the column was fully committed to the breach, 2 more Russian tanks emerged, moving at pace towards the column and firing. Via UAV feeds, the command post watched the emergence of the enemy, and fires were brought down to try to disrupt the action. Exposed, the breaching company attempted to accelerate through the breach, but deviated from course. All vehicles in the company were then immobilized by mine strikes in quick succession. So again, it's that idea of you clear this one path, and that's all you can stick to. If you want to send vehicles left or right, you run the risk, as they did, of every single one of those vehicles being destroyed by a mine. It's just, there's no easy solution to dealing with minefields. And that's what we're going to see come up as a theme over and over again here, especially as Russia has doubled and tripled down on how many mines they're laying in some of these areas. It's just, there's no easy way to do that without, losing a lot of vehicles, quite frankly. The article continues, recognizing the importance of expanding the ground held to disperse the force from Russian fires, the Ukrainian commander deployed 2 assault groups to reinforce. While dense foliage prevented overhead observation by drones, these troops advanced cautiously to the western end of Novodarivka and began to assault Russian positions to secure the crossroads that bifurcated the settlement. After some fierce fighting, the Russian troops withdrew eastwards to prevent their positions from being isolated. So first off, these battles, I don't think got a lot of attention. Right, they're company size, platoon size level assaults, and really what a lot of people have been focused on since this offensive kicked off is where they're brigades, right? These large formations, thousands, not hundreds or dozens as some of these are. So I do think these kind of went under the radar. But what we're going to see are Russian troops moving back. Not necessarily in full-blown panic. And that's one of the things that the authors hit on here is even when Russian troops are pushed back, it's not a rout. It's not what we saw in Kharkiv last fall. It tends to be more calculated. And Russia has even come up with some methods to, be ready for it, in a sense, prepare, knowing that they're going to fall back as Ukrainian forces take some of these positions. They add, before any further advances could be taken, it was necessary to deal with the Russian company in front of the village of Rivnopil to the east. They say Ukrainian commanders were wary. They had lost 2 companies of equipment to take Novodarivka. Such a loss rate was not sustainable if they were to eventually breach the Surovikin line. It was therefore essential that the assault on Rivnopil positions was accomplished without similar setbacks. So again, go back to the opening days of this offensive, of this counteroffensive, and you remember all the pictures of smoking Ukrainian vehicles and vehicles being blown up left and right that, quite frankly, in a lot of are still being circulated to a degree, right, to talk about how this counteroffensive hasn't worked. But that was the challenge right out the gate. They suffered significant losses. Now, it was at the company level. It wasn't a brigade or multiple brigades worth of equipment, but it looks like Ukraine saw that, and understandably so. It was like, we can't continue on at this rate, especially in the opening moments, the opening few hundred meters of trying to breach, kilometers worth of Russian positions. In some areas, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers deep of Russian defenses. That won't continue. They say the attacking force, now talking about Rivnopil, was augmented with 2 tanks from a neighboring brigade and a battery of artillery. So that battery of artillery then in direct support, whatever the troops on the ground need. They say the tanks moving in and out of cover engaged the Russian firing positions to draw the attention of and suppress the defenders. Shortly thereafter, artillery strikes from the fighting positions were combined with the delivery of smoke in front of the tanks. The tanks worked forwards, giving the impression that smoke was being used to cover the advance of infantry. Smoke is something that we've seen appear a little bit more during this counteroffensive over the last, I'll say from the beginning of the counteroffensive. But we're going to get into that here in a little bit. There's a reason that Ukrainian commanders are hesitant to use it, and you can understand why. The authors continue, while the tanks fixed the attention of the defense, a platoon of multiple Ukrainian assault troops moved along the tree line to the east of the Russian fighting positions. From there, it began to lay down suppressing fire and advance in pairs. The action drew the attention of the defense, which now recognized a clear tactical play with a fixing action to its front and a major assault about to be launched against its flank. So again, when we're talking about, these are little vignettes of how things have played out on the battlefield, and it shows how the tactics have changed. But it's very hard to take. We're talking about a platoon size element, right? That could be 20 to 50 on the very high side, probably less than that. We're talking about a platoon size element moving forward in pairs. It's very, very hard to look at that event and the trench line that they eventually take here as indicative of the overall war. Either way, right? Whether it's a Russian platoon or a Ukrainian platoon, that's a very small scale sample, all things considered, for the size of the war. But it does help understand how the tactics are evolving throughout the rest of the theater. They say, disoriented and fearing encirclement, the Russian troops began to withdraw towards Rivnopil, abandoning their communications equipment and leaving 5 troops behind who were taken prisoner. Ukrainian forces had to exploit the attack quickly, advancing beyond the company position because its coordinates, the trench line, were pre-registered with Russian artillery, which delivered strikes on the trenches. So, again, these forward positions, it's been a mixed bag. Russia has put a lot of energy, time, and effort into stopping the Ukrainians right out the gate. But the way that this defense in depth is structured is that Russia is going to be pulling back. They have more defenses behind them. So the first level of defenses, that first open area with the minefields, the first level of trenches, as they continue to move back, is designed to just attrit Ukrainian forces, not necessarily stop them. So one of the things Russia was doing early in this counteroffensive was they just had pre-planned artillery on their own trenches. So as soon as Ukraine moved forward, kicked the Russians out of there and occupied the trenches, because it's the only protected area, right? They're actually able to take some cover. All of a sudden, Russian artillery starts raining down. They say eventually Russian troops withdrew across a water obstacle behind the village and blew several agricultural dams to flood the area, establishing a string of anti-tank guided weapons firing posts in the tree lines beyond. The density of the anti-tank guided weapons, or ATGMs, was significant, with approximately 4 launchers per tree line with 50 missiles each. That is a lot of guided missiles. Any type of armored approach coming anywhere near that tree line, it's going to come at a heavy cost. Right? That is a very fortified tree line, all things considered. When kind of summarizing these tactical events here, the authors say that when talking, kind of overall about how these tactical events played out, the authors say the rate of advance during this period was one tactical advance for 3 days of fighting, with each advance moving the line of control approximately 700 to 1,200 meters forward. Adding, whereas the first tactical advance against Novodarivka cost 2 companies worth of equipment, losses throughout the attack on Rivnopil were light. But again, and I think this is one of the challenges with keeping up with the war at this point is I think a lot of people expected large-scale brigade-level armored thrusts through the front lines, and we're tracking, one major Ukrainian column pushing through. But in reality, it's been so many of these squad, platoon, and company-level fights, for one tree line at a time. And taking Rivnopil and Novodarivka were big steps because they can't advance without taking those. It's slow. Again, we're going to talk more about the minefields, but this is just not, I think, what was envisioned in terms of maneuver warfare. It's still happening, just at a different pace than I think a lot of people anticipated. Now, moving first here into Russian lessons learned and what Russia has taken from essentially the counteroffensive so far, but really the war as a whole and what they're doing now on the battlefield. When looking at these tactical fights, the authors say, in short, Russia achieved tactical success in preventing a breakthrough and could achieve operational success if it continued to inflict comparable equipment losses on the enemy. Attrition of personnel, however, if it remained consistent into the autumn, posed a risk of operational defeat, while loss of artillery systems threatened a reduction in capacity to attrit Ukrainian troops. And given this dynamic, several adaptations were made to Russian defensive operations. So adding a little context here, when we're talking about the tactical level fight, that's more of a squad, platoon, or company size element taking a trench line north of Rivnopil. That's the tactical level. Operational level is pretty broad, but could be as much, as narrow as the southern portion, the southern front in Ukraine, or as much as the entire Ukrainian war theater of operations. So what they're getting at here is Russia might be able to win those tactical fights, continuing on as they have, but the losses that Russia sustained in attriting Ukrainian forces is not going to play out long term. Now, getting into the actual adaptations, they say the first Russian adaptation was to increase the depth of minefields. Russian minefields had been doctrinally set down as 120 meters deep prior to this offensive. But following the early clashes, it was noted that this depth of mines was breachable by Miklik and UR-77s to a sufficient depth to enable infantry to get into Russian defensive positions. So the mine-clearing line charges from armored vehicles can fire a line of C4, detonate, and open up a path for other vehicles to move through. 120 meters was not that much to create an entire opening for Ukrainian forces. They say the aim, therefore, has been to increase the depth of minefields to up to 500 meters, well beyond any rapid breaching capability. And that right there is where you're starting to see a slowdown in the overall pace of operations. 500 meters, multiple Mikliks to get through that. And then you've got one very, very narrow lane. And, as we talked about earlier, the narrower that lane, the longer that lane goes on, the more susceptible you are to other systems like tanks or BMPs coming out and engaging the column, artillery, aircraft, UAVs, whatever it might be. They do point to a couple implications here, however. It's not like Russia solved this and, it's all in their favor going forward. First, they say the Russian logistics systems were organized to equip brigades with sufficient mines to comply with doctrinal templates, right? So they would look at how much land a brigade was going to hold and say you need 120 meters deep across your front, you get 1,000 mines, let's say, right? Making that up. But they say the increased depth of the minefields means that Russian forces have had insufficient mines to consistently meet this laydown with a density of mines consistent with their new doctrine. So what they're starting to see are more improvised explosive devices and things like stacking 2, 3, 4, even 5 mines on top of one another, recognizing that they're not going to be able, the Russian forces aren't going to be able to meet, the density across the minefield. But if they can put a couple of these anti-tank mines on top of one another and a vehicle strikes that, it's not just going to be disabled, right? It's going to completely destroy the vehicle. So it is changing how the Russians are laying out their minefields. They also add that Russia has assessed the practice of setting pre-registered fires to engage their own positions once they are lost is inefficient and dangerous when the enemy has an artillery advantage in terms of counter-battery detection, range, and accuracy. So again, this was the idea of knowing the coordinates of your own trenches and handing those off to the gun crews, and if need be, if they're taken by Ukrainian forces, you just rain down artillery fire on the pre-planned targets. Not working, because then those guns open up, they're immediately put in range, or could be in range, of Ukrainian counter-battery, and then Russia's losing more howitzers. So they say to solve these problems, the Russians have resorted to preparing their fighting positions for reserve demolition. This is often done with improvised charges. The template is to detonate the first line once Ukrainian troops enter the fighting positions, while Russian forces withdraw through the rear of the trenches. So they're rigging them up like booby traps, in a sense, right? You look at some of these battlefields, there's not a lot of places to take cover. You're going to want to find a bunker or something to get into to protect you from all the death and destruction flying above. And Russia has littered some of those with explosive devices to detonate once Ukraine seeks the shelter of the old Russian trenches. Another aspect they get into in terms of Russian tactics is a lot of kind of small counterattacks. Anytime Ukraine advances, they're seeing a lot of these, 2 or 3 tank Russian counterattacks. They say it's worth noting that Russia often loses the tanks used for these counterattacks, but they inflict disproportionate damage because the mines constrain Ukrainian vehicles in their ability to maneuver or respond, which, everything's a trade-off in a war, right? And if you're sitting on the Russian side, it seems like not a bad trade-off. 2 or 3 tanks to stop a Ukrainian column trying to breach the lines. And, the examples earlier around Novodarivka, relatively sitting ducks when they get into those minefields. Now, a couple of those examples, there were anti-tank teams that came out, eliminated the Russian tanks, and the assault was able to continue forward. But, the right time, the right place, you can see how this would play out in Russia's favor. Continuing on, they say getting into artillery, that what we've seen so far in this war, really leading up to the last few months, was a statistical method that goes back to the Second World War, where Russia had established levels of fire that were assessed to deliver specific effects against defined targets. For example, 720 rounds were assessed to be necessary to achieve the suppression of a platoon fighting position. It's a lot of ammo. And so the way they would look at it is, and we kind of have things like that in the United States, a rough idea of how many rounds are going to be needed to achieve a desired result. But what they're saying is that Russia was sticking to that to the T. It's like if they had an armored column in the open, they were going to fire X number of rounds no matter what. They say it is an approach that the Russians now assess to be non-viable. First, the Russian forces lack the ammunition to sustain this volume of fire. It's a lot of rounds. Second, the logistics enabling such a volume of fire is too vulnerable to detection and long-range precision strikes. Third, the loss of counter-battery radar and barrel wear have meant that this mass approach to fire suppression is of diminishing effectiveness. So pretty clear cut there, right? First, it takes a ton of ammunition, and it might not be the best way forward. Second, the logistics moving the rounds forward to the front are within range of Ukrainian, call it loitering munitions, HIMARS strikes, whatever it might be. And then every time one of those Russian pieces fires, and in this case, they're having to put out, dozens or hundreds of rounds apiece, they're in one location, they become vulnerable to any number of counter-battery measures that Ukraine has at their disposal. So what they're seeing is that Russia is starting to focus on effects being prioritized over volume. Another way to say that, quality over quantity. They say that Russian production of the Krasnopol 152 laser-guided shells has been prioritized, with newly manufactured shells being widely available across the front. This is a really big change. And the authors get into how this is not just going to be an issue for Ukraine right now, but it's something that NATO is going to have to deal with going forward. They say the trend appears to be towards maximizing accuracy and reducing the number of rounds necessary to achieve the desired outcome rather than resorting to saturation fire. This is a concerning trend, as over time it will likely significantly improve Russian artillery. As an artilleryman, thinking about that, it's kind of nice in a sense. If you've got the long-range systems and you've got the counter-battery assets, if you're facing an enemy that is focused on just mass fire saturation, those guns are going to be firing for a long time, and it gives us a lot of opportunity to take them out one after the other, and just kind of systematically dismantle their fire's capability. As they move more and more towards what we use in the United States, the fewer rounds but more accurate rounds becomes harder to deal with, quite frankly. So that shift for Russia, and it's going to take a while. It's not something they're going to come up with overnight. But that would make anybody a more challenging adversary to have to deal with. Now, moving into what Ukraine has done in terms of their adaptations, they say insofar as Ukrainian forces have been able to make progress during the offensive, it has been dependent on fire superiority. Outranging the Russians, combined with having better means for detecting enemy artillery and carrying out counter-battery fires, is an essential Ukrainian advantage. And this goes back to what I talked about at the very beginning of the article, that example of how Ukraine was able to stay in one place and continue firing when just 6 months ago they couldn't do that because the threat of counter battery is so high. I've mentioned before, and I've mentioned before, citing other people that talk about the local fire superiority on the battlefield, and that's exactly what they're getting at here. It's not big picture. Ukraine has more artillery than Russia or anything like that. It's that in these certain areas where Ukraine is advancing, they have gathered the appropriate systems and resources to have an advantage in the artillery war, right? So again, it's not Ukraine has an artillery advantage over Russia. It's in these specific areas Ukraine has the upper hand. Continuing on, the authors say that Ukrainian troops note that Western-provided platforms are vastly superior to their Soviet legacy-protected mobility platforms for one fundamental reason: crew survivability. I've seen some threads on Twitter coming out about people saying Ukrainian forces are talking with their trainers that they worked with outside of Ukraine, some of the NATO trainers, and hearing that they put, say, 60 guys through training in Bradleys, and like at one point, 11 Bradleys have been lost and all of the crew members were alive. Like that's significant, right? That is a big difference. So what they say about that is, while Western supplied protected mobility may be doing a good job enabling their dismounts to survive, there is still a high loss rate of platforms. These platforms are often mobility killed rather than destroyed, but rebuilding them demands a consistent provision of spare parts that is challenging for vehicles that are no longer in production. Again, therefore, Ukraine's international partners need to ensure that the industrial support is available to make the Ukrainian military sustainable. That is a big picture theme in this piece from Reynolds and Watling, talking about the sustainability of the current, make of the Ukrainian military. They've just got so many different vehicles and howitzers and everything from all around the world. And some of them, the reason that we were able to get them, everybody outside of Ukraine, able to get them there so quickly, is they're not being used elsewhere. Right? They're starting to be decommissioned. It's like, well, hey, if we're going to get rid of these things, may as well give them to Ukraine. They could use armored mobility, right? And it saved lives, and it was the right thing at the right time to get that in their hands. But when those things break down and those contracts are voided, and there's not a factory building the spare parts anymore because the host nation isn't using it, it's a problem, right? It's like a one-time use type vehicle. Continuing on, the authors say the Ukrainian operations are inherently limited in their tempo, talking about the minefields. They say any advance cannot be carried out in depth and often relies on dismounted engineers to identify and clear minefields. It's therefore very difficult to plan operations beyond the defenses immediately in front of Ukrainian positions, meaning that breaches forward are difficult to exploit. Again, taking it back, I think what a lot of people thought is you breach that first line, or you breach a line of Russian defenses, or you breach a minefield, whatever it might be, and you blink, and Ukraine has advanced 40, 50, 60 kilometers, and they're just off to the races, which is a possibility. With any defensive structure, that is a possibility. When there is a break, it opens the door to a rapid collapse, just the nature of how most defenses are built. But the challenge with how thick these minefields are is they can't plan for that. They have to have these very skilled, specific resources forward at every moment to be able to clear another path so they don't lose all of their vehicles advancing forward. A different one that I haven't heard a lot about here that I thought was interesting is they say planning remains a significant challenge for Ukrainian units. They say the rapid expansion of the armed forces of Ukraine with the mobilization of civilians means there are many more units than staff. So we're kind of getting into one of the boring sides of war here. They say the limitation of staff sections, so intelligence, logistics, operations, that kind of thing. It says this limits the scale at which brigades can combine arms, especially during offensive operations where planning times are compressed. This was an area of support identified as a requirement in early June 2022, but Ukraine's partners have not effectively provided it. It is vital that any staff training that is offered is not premised on putting Ukrainian staff through academic courses aimed at creating NATO staff officers. Got to train them for the fight they're in. Give them the resources to execute and function in how they know the battlefield. And there's a piece I covered previously talking much more on the soldier level, right? The tactical level tasks that are being taught from the NATO trainers to the Ukrainian troops, and some misses there and some ways that maybe that can do better. This is moving up the chain a bit. I got to think starting at least at battalion level, battalion, brigade, and up, and how those officers can effectively plan a combined arms operation in a shortened window. Look, it's not easy, and I think we take it for granted. I think a lot of NATO countries take it for granted because we practice that so much, and a lot of that practice is done in a very, very safe environment, right? The majority of our practice when it comes to planning large-scale combat operations, the risk you run when you get it wrong is a bad grade or something, right? Or a bad evaluation. There aren't actual lives on the line. Ukraine doesn't have that option right now, right? They have to learn it fast, and they are going to, no matter how we train them on it, they're going to be using it very soon in a situation where lives are on the line. And sticking with that for a minute, they say there's not enough time in the course, the NATO training courses, to move on to collective training, even at the company level. So they say one of the reasons for that is that we take so long to get people up to, in the Army, things like squad live fire or company live fire. It takes a full year of training to get the unit to the point where we're comfortable doing that. And they're saying that the authors here are saying a big part of that is safety. We want to be safe during training operations. And I got it, right? You don't want to lose anybody during a training operation. But again, this is something that Ukraine doesn't have that option. They have to go through more advanced training, more dangerous training to a degree, because if they don't do those platoon company level live fires under the threat of artillery with drones overhead in a training environment, even though it is more dangerous than not doing it, the first time they're going to do it then is 6 weeks later on the battlefields of Ukraine where their friends are dying. So it's just one of those where the NATO training mindset right now isn't exactly working. And I agree with that. I think it was a really good point they brought up here. We can't look at this like training NATO troops where we're going to have months or years or even decades to get people ready and can really kind of slowly move the training forward. It's got to be fast, and it's got to be, honestly, more dangerous than most of what we go through, here in the United States. Now, something I talked about a little bit previously was smoke missions for artillery, and they hit on it here, and I thought it was really interesting. They said only 3% of Ukrainian artillery fire missions are smoke missions. I like having that stat. I don't know that jumps off the page necessarily. You'd expect most to be high explosive type rounds, HE, just the nature of the fight. Even if they were using smoke for every one of their offensive maneuver operations, 3% might cover that, right? So anyway, it's just interesting to see that number. But they say the reason that commanders are not using smoke very often is that they prioritize maintaining their own understanding of the battlefield over laying down smoke and concealing their personnel's movement. I'll bet that rings home for anybody who spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan. You'd constantly have a drone overhead, and the boss would just want to watch what was going on, or a blimp, and they'd want to see exactly what you're doing at every time. Now, the authors kind of, they seed a little bit there, saying one of the reasons for this is that commanders can then apply artillery very quickly or resource assets, right? They can send drones, coordinate artillery strikes, whatever it might be, or resupply, whatever it might be, because they're watching the battlefield. Especially when it comes to the lethal effects. If from a drone overhead you're able to spot a Russian howitzer that maybe the troops on the ground can't see, then got it, right? There's a benefit there. But it does seem what they're getting at here in the piece is that there's still a little bit of a lack of trust of letting those junior leaders, even at the company level and below, execute the operation as they see fit and giving them resources. Like moving forward under a smokescreen is going to be a lot better than being out there in the wide open. We've seen a lot of these early operations in Ukraine. They're moving forward. They're taking the fight to the Russian forces in broad daylight. You kind of wonder, like, where's the smoke screen? And they have been out there. You see them from time to time, just not all that often. I thought it was interesting because the challenge of trust of a commander down to the lowest level, it seems like it has no language barriers, right? Now, in wrapping up, Watling and Reynolds say it's also important to recognize that Russian forces are fighting more competently and with more reasonable tenacity in the defense. Although they are losing ground, Russian forces are largely conducting orderly withdrawals from positions and are effectively slowing down and thereby managing Ukrainian advances while imposing a considerable cost in equipment. That is in line with most analysis I've seen over the last few weeks, I'd say. We're starting to get a lot more people kind of looking big picture at this offensive, and you're not seeing anybody at this point say those stupid Russians don't know what to do. No, quality analyst, I'll say, making fun of the Russians. They're saying, hey, this is a significant It's a significant ask to push through these lines, and they're competent and they're learning, right? Which, in my opinion, I think that's important. The minute we start writing off anybody, we start to lose the edge a little bit, if you will. And finally, in terms of what countries can do going forward, the authors say it's now clear that the conflict will protract. It is therefore important that Ukraine's international partners invest now to give Ukraine protracted advantages. Failure to make timely adjustment to support will come at a heavy price in 2024. So again, these guys, I'm on the same page with these guys, 100% agree this war is not going to end in 2023. It's hard to predict, what needs to happen for the war to actually wrap up, but it's going to go forward for quite a while. And I think a lot of the lessons learned during this counteroffensive, things like we hit on in the article, the quantity of breaching equipment necessary, the quantity of artillery shells needed, the uniformity in the vehicles and the equipment for Ukrainian forces. It was a lot of last minute, put things together as best you could, but for the argument for supporting Ukraine, you have to look out and recognize this war is going to be fought again in the spring, and it's going to be fought again next summer. So if we look out a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and start putting together more coherent packages, more long-term type support, that's what they're getting at. It's, kind of missed the mark on that first time around, I think. It was a lot of ad hoc is what it seemed like. But if we can recognize this war is going to go on for a long time, it might allow a more, clear path forward in supporting Ukraine in this war. But that's all I got for now. Again, I will link the article in the description below, as well as where you can find Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds on Twitter. And of course, if interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the Sit Rep I put out on Substack. It's once a week, direct to your inbox, 7 to 10 of the biggest national security stories over that period of time, as well as a few podcast recommendations. Link to that is also in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.